Nathaniel Cross stood frozen at the head of the dining table, his fork halfway to his mouth, because the woman sitting across from his mother had just said 4 words that made the entire room go silent. She looked directly into his mother's eyes and said she knew the truth. Margaret Cross did not blink. She did not flinch, but her hand, resting on the white tablecloth, curled slowly into a fist, and for the first time in 20 years, someone in that house watched fear cross her face instead of cause it. Before we continue, if this story is pulling you in already, take 2 seconds to hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this with someone who loves a good billionaire family secret. It helps this channel more than you know, and trust me, what happens next in this house is going to keep you up tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Nathaniel Cross was 34 years old and worth more money than most small countries. He owned buildings that touched the clouds in 6 cities. He owned an airline. He owned a shipping company that moved goods across every ocean on Earth. But none of that mattered inside the walls of the Cross family mansion, because inside those walls, only one person ever truly ruled, and that person was his mother. Margaret Cross was 71 years old, thin as a blade, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and eyes the color of a winter sky right before a storm. The staff who worked in that house did not love her. They feared her. Maids who dropped a single spoon were let go before the sun set. Drivers who arrived 1 minute late lost their jobs without a single word of explanation. Even Nathaniel, a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, felt his stomach tighten every single time his mother walked into a room. Nobody knew why she was the way she was. There were rumors, of course. Some of the older staff whispered that something happened to her decades ago, long before Nathaniel was born, something so terrible that she built a wall around her heart and never let anyone climb over it again. But nobody dared ask her directly. The one time a young assistant tried, gently, respectfully, asking about her early life, Margaret set down her teacup so slowly and so quietly that the sound of porcelain touching the saucer felt louder than a gunshot. The assistant packed her things that same afternoon. Nathaniel had grown up in that silence. He remembered being 6 years old, sitting at the very same long dining table, watching his mother eat without ever once looking up from her plate. He remembered asking her, in the small voice of a child who just wanted his mother to smile at him, whether she loved him. She had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had said that love was a weakness rich families could not afford, and that he would understand one day. He never forgot those words. They lived in him like a splinter that never worked its way out. By the time Nathaniel became an adult, he had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. Magazine covers called him the most eligible bachelor in the country. Business journals called him a genius. But behind closed doors in the quiet hours after midnight, he sat alone in his enormous office, staring at the city lights, feeling like the loneliest man alive. He did not trust easily. He did not open up easily. His mother had taught him, without ever meaning to, that softness got you hurt. That was until the night a stranger walked into his life and turned everything upside down. Her name was Sophie Bennett, and she worked as a waitress at a small diner 3 blocks from Nathaniel's downtown office tower. The kind of diner with cracked red booths and a bell above the door that jingled every time someone walked in. Sophie was 28 years old, with warm brown eyes and a laugh that came easily, the kind of laugh that made strangers feel like old friends. She had grown up poor, raised by a single father who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and she had learned early in life that kindness cost nothing but meant everything. Sophie did not know who Nathaniel Cross was the night he wandered in her diner, exhausted, rain-free but soaked in stress, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her entire apartment. He sat in the corner booth and ordered black coffee and said almost nothing. She noticed the way his shoulders sat, tense and tight, like a man carrying the weight of the whole world. So she did what she always did. She was kind to him. She refilled his coffee without being asked. She told him a small joke to see if she could get him a smile. And when he finally did smile, just barely, just for a second, something in her chest warmed in a way she did not expect. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Soon it became a quiet routine, this billionaire slipping away from his glass tower, to sit in a cracked red booth and talk with a waitress who had no idea what his last name meant. For the first time in his adult life, Nathaniel felt like someone was talking to him, not to his money. Sophie asked him about his childhood, his dreams, the things that scared him, and he found himself answering honestly, more honestly than he had answered anyone in years. One night, weeks into this quiet friendship, Sophie finally asked him what he did for a living. He hesitated for a long moment, then told her the truth. He watched her face carefully, waiting for the shift he had seen 100 times before, the moment when a person's eyes changed once they realized how much money was sitting across from them. But it never came. Sophie just laughed and said that explained why he tipped so strangely large, and then she asked him if he wanted pie. That was the moment Nathaniel knew he was in trouble, the good kind of trouble, the kind he had never let himself feel before. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, like a plant pushing up through concrete. Nathaniel started inviting her to small places, quiet places, away from cameras and headlines. He was terrified of what would happen if the world found out, and more than that, he was terrified of what would happen if his mother found out. He knew, deep in his bones, that Margaret Cross would never approve of a woman like Sophie. Not because there was anything wrong with Sophie, but because Margaret did not approve of love at all. For months, Nathaniel kept Sophie hidden from his world, and Sophie, patient and understanding, never pushed him. She could see the fear behind his eyes whenever his mother's name came up in conversation, and something told her that fear went deeper than simple family tension. It felt old. It felt like a wound that had never healed. Then, one evening, everything changed. Margaret Cross announced, without asking, without warning, that she was hosting a formal dinner at the mansion, and that Nathaniel was expected to bring a guest. This was unusual. Margaret never asked about his personal life. She never seemed to care whether he was alone or not. But this time, there was something different in her voice, something almost calculating, as if she already suspected he was hiding someone. Nathaniel spent 3 sleepless nights deciding what to do. Part of him wanted to protect Sophie from his mother entirely, to keep this new fragile happiness far away from a woman who had crushed every soft thing she had ever touched. But another part of him, a part that was tired of hiding, a part that was tired of being controlled by fear, even as a grown man, wanted to finally stand in front of his mother with someone he cared about and refused to be ashamed. He chose the second option. He invited Sophie to the dinner. Sophie said yes immediately, though her stomach twisted with nerves the moment she hung up the phone. She had heard whispers about Margaret Cross from newspapers and gossip columns, stories about a cold, unreachable woman who ruled her son's empire from the shadows. But Sophie told herself that stories were often exaggerated, that no mother could truly be as frightening as the rumors claimed. She was wrong. The night of the dinner arrived, and Sophie stood outside the towering iron gates of the Cross mansion in a simple navy dress, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Nathaniel met her at the entrance, and the moment he saw her, some of the tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. He took her hand and led her inside. The mansion was breathtaking, all marble floors and chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars, but Sophie barely noticed any of it, because the moment she stepped into the dining room, she felt the temperature of the entire house drop. Margaret Cross sat at the head of the long table, dressed in black, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it looked as if it might hurt. She did not stand to greet them. She simply looked at Sophie up and down, slowly, the way a jeweler examines a stone to determine if it is real or fake. Dinner began, and for the first 20 minutes, everything was unbearably polite. The staff moved silently around the table, refilling glasses, clearing plates, never making a sound. Margaret asked Sophie a series of questions, each one sharper than the last. Where did she grow up? What did her father do for work? Why had she never gone to college? Each question felt less like curiosity and more like a knife being slowly sharpened. Sophie answered every question with honesty and grace, refusing to shrink under the pressure, and Nathaniel watched her with a quiet pride that surprised even him. No one had ever stood their ground against his mother like this. Not once. Not ever. But then Margaret set down her fork, folded her hands, and asked one final question, a question that made the entire room go still. She asked Sophie what exactly she thought she was doing, sitting at this table, pretending she belonged in a world she clearly did not understand. The air in the room turned to ice. Nathaniel opened his mouth to defend Sophie. But before he could speak, Sophie set down her own fork, calmly, deliberately, and looked directly into Margaret's eyes. And that was the moment. That was the exact moment Sophie said the 4 words that changed everything. She said she knew the truth. Margaret's face did not move, but something behind her eyes did. Something old. Something buried. For the briefest second, the coldest woman in the city looked like a frightened little girl. Nathaniel looked back and forth between the 2 women, utterly confused. He had never seen his mother react to anyone this way, not once in 34 years. He asked Sophie what she meant, his voice shaking slightly, and Sophie took a breath before she answered. She explained that before she ever became a waitress, before life forced her into that small crack booth diner, her father had once worked as a private driver for a wealthy family decades ago, a family whose name he never spoke aloud except once, late at night, when he thought Sophie was already asleep. He had whispered a story to her mother about a young housekeeper who had once worked for the Cross family, a woman who had fallen in love with the family's only son and had gotten pregnant, only to be thrown out onto the street the moment the truth was discovered, silenced with money and threats so that the family name would never be stained. The room went completely silent. Nathaniel felt his entire world tilt sideways. He turned to his mother, his voice barely above a whisper, and asked if what Sophie was saying could possibly be true. Margaret said nothing. She simply stared at her plate, her hands trembling for the first time anyone in that house had ever witnessed. And then, without a single word, she stood up from the table and walked out of the room, leaving her son and a stranger sitting in stunned silence beneath the chandeliers, the truth hanging heavy in the air like smoke after a fire. That night, Nathaniel did not sleep at all. He sat in his office long after Sophie had gone home, staring at old family photographs, trying to piece together a history he suddenly realized he had never truly understood. He always believed his mother had married into wealth, that she came from a modest background before meeting his father, a hardworking man who built a family. Fortune from nothing. But now, a terrifying question sat in his chest like a stone. What if his mother was not who everyone believed her to be? What if the fear she carried, the coldness she wrapped around herself like armor, came from something far darker than simple ambition? The next morning, Nathaniel confronted his mother directly. He found her in the garden, sitting alone on a stone bench, staring at nothing. He asked her, gently but firmly, to finally tell him the truth. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. Then, in a voice quieter than he had ever heard her use, she began to speak. She told him that decades ago, before she became Margaret Cross, she was a young woman named Margaret Hale, working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in another city. She fell in love with the family's son, a kind but weak man who loved her too, but who was too afraid of his own parents to ever stand up for her. When she became pregnant, his family discovered the truth and reacted exactly as families like that always did. They paid her off. They threatened her. They told her that if she ever spoke a single word about the child, they would destroy her, her reputation, her future, everything. She was forced to leave. Alone. Pregnant. Terrified. She gave birth to a baby boy in a small hospital far from anyone who knew her. And for 3 unbearable days, she held that baby and loved him more than she believed a heart could love anything. But she had no money, no family, nowhere to go, and a desperate, broken decision was made that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She left the baby at the steps of a church, wrapped in a blue blanket, and she never saw him again. Nathaniel sat frozen on that garden bench, unable to speak. His mother continued, her voice cracking for the first time in his entire memory. She said that after that day, something inside her closed forever. She swore she would never again be weak enough to lose someone she loved. She swore she would build a fortress around her heart so strong that nothing could ever break in and nothing could ever be taken from her again. Years later, She met Nathaniel's father, a wealthy man who admired her sharp mind and cold composure, and she built a new life, a new name, a new fortress of money and power. But the fortress had a price. It meant she could never truly let herself love her own son the way she wanted to, because loving meant risking loss, and she had already lost more than her heart could survive once. Nathaniel sat in silence, tears in his eyes, finally understanding 34 years of distance, 34 years of cold dinners and unanswered hugs, 34 years of a mother who built walls instead of memories. It was not that she never loved him. It was that she was too terrified to ever let herself love him fully, because somewhere out there, decades ago, she had already loved and lost a child she never got to raise. But the story did not end there, because Sophie, sitting quietly in the next room, listening through the open door, felt her heart pounding for an entirely different reason. Because the story Margaret just told, the hospital, the blue blanket, the church steps, matched almost exactly a story Sophie's own father used to tell her, a story about how he was found as a baby on the steps of a small church, wrapped in a blue blanket, with no note, no name, nothing at all except a tiny golden locket pinned to the fabric. Sophie stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, and asked Margaret one question. She asked what happened to the locket that was left with her baby. Margaret turned, confused, and answered that she had pinned a small golden locket to the blanket before she left him, a locket that had belonged to her own mother, the only piece of her old life she gave to her son before letting him go forever. The room went completely silent, because Sophie knew that locket. She had seen it 100 times. It sat in a small wooden box in her father's dresser drawer, the only item he owned from a life before the church steps found him a family. Sophie's father was not just a random man who once worked as a driver. Sophie's father was Margaret's son, the baby left on the church steps decades ago, which meant that the frightened, brave young woman sitting at that dinner table just days earlier, the one who dared to speak the truth no one else could say, was not simply a stranger who uncovered secret. She was Margaret Cross's own granddaughter. Nathaniel sat frozen, staring between his mother and the woman he had fallen in love with, as the weight of the revelation settled over the room like a wave crashing onto shore. The woman he loved, the woman he had hidden from his mother, the woman his mother had cruelly interrogated at that dinner table, was family. Blood. The missing piece of a story that had haunted this house for over 3 decades. Margaret's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sat down heavily on the garden bench, her hands covering her mouth, tears finally breaking through eyes that had not cried in over 30 years. She looked at Sophie, really looked at her, searching her face for traces of the son she had given up, and found them there, in the shape of her eyes, in the curve of her smile. For a long, aching moment, nobody spoke. The garden was silent except for the soft sound of Margaret's crying, a sound none of the staff had ever heard in all their years working in that house. Sophie slowly walked forward and knelt beside her, and though her own hands were shaking, she reached out and gently took Margaret's hand. She told Margaret that her father, the baby who had been left on those church steps, had grown up loved. He had been adopted by a kind, poor family who raised him with warmth and honesty, teaching him to work hard and never take a single blessing for granted. He grew up to become a good man, a hardworking driver who loved his daughter more than life itself, who told her stories every night before bed about a mysterious golden locket, and a mother he never got to know but never once resented. He always told Sophie that whoever left him that locket must have loved him enough to leave behind the one piece of beauty she had, and that love, even hidden, even silent, was still love. Margaret broke down completely at those words, decades of buried grief finally rising to the surface all at once. She had spent 30 years believing she destroyed a life by leaving that child behind. She never imagined that somewhere out there, he had grown up surrounded by love, and that love had somehow made its way, quietly, invisibly, back to her own front door in the form of a waitress with warm brown eyes and an unshakable sense of kindness. In the days that followed, the Cross Mansion transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. Margaret asked to meet Sophie's father, her long-lost son, And the reunion that took place in that same dining room was nothing like the cold dinner that had happened just weeks before. There were tears. There was fear. There was decades of pain that could not be erased in a single conversation. But there was also, for the first time in a very long time, the fragile beginning of healing. Margaret confessed everything to her son, to Sophie's father, the truth she had hidden even from herself for 30 years. She told him she never stopped thinking about him, not for a single day, and that the cold fortress she built around her heart was never meant to keep him out. It was only ever meant to protect her from the unbearable pain of losing someone else she loved. He listened quietly, patiently, and though the wound of being left behind was not something that could vanish overnight, he found himself, slowly, cautiously, willing to build something new with a mother he never knew. Nathaniel and Sophie stood together during all of this, watching a family that had been broken for 3 decades slowly begin to stitch itself back together. And through it all, something between them had changed too. The fear that once made Nathaniel hide Sophie from his world had disappeared completely, replaced by something steady and certain. He no longer worried about what his mother would think, because for the first time in his life, he understood his mother completely, and understanding her had somehow set him free from the fear she had unknowingly passed down to him. One quiet evening, months later, Nathaniel took Sophie back to the same small diner where they first met. The cracked red booths, the bell above the door, the smell of coffee and warm pie. He sat across from her in the very same corner booth, and this time, it was his turn to speak honestly. He told her that she had not only shown him what real love looked like, but she had also, without even knowing it, given his mother back the family she thought she lost forever. He reached into his pocket and placed a small velvet box on the table between them. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, nothing like the extravagant jewelry his family was known for, because he told her he did not want to give her something that represented his money. He wanted to give her something that represented the quiet, honest love she had shown him since the very first night she refilled his coffee without being asked. Sophie cried and laughed and said yes before he even finished the question. Margaret Cross, the woman everyone in that mansion once feared, the woman whose cold stare could silence an entire room, stood at the back of the small church months later during their wedding, wearing not black, but a soft shade of blue, the same color as the blanket she once wrapped around a baby she thought she would never see grow up. She watched her son marry the granddaughter she never knew she had, and for the first time in over 30 years, she smiled a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The staff at the Cross Mansion noticed the change almost immediately. Margaret still carried herself with quiet strength, still commanded respect the moment she entered a room, but the icy fear that once followed her through every hallway had melted away, replaced by something warmer, something that almost resembled peace. She began having dinner with her newly reunited son every single week, listening to stories about the childhood she missed, slowly filling in 30 years of empty space with laughter and memory. Nathaniel, for the first time in his adult life, felt something he had never truly felt before. He felt like he belonged to a real family, not one built on fear and silence, but one built on truth, no matter how painful that truth had been to uncover. He often thought back to that first dinner, the night a stranger sat across from his terrifying mother and calmly said 4 words that changed everything. He used to think that night was the night his world fell apart. Now he understood it was the night his world finally became whole. Sophie often visited the small diner where it all began, sometimes alone, sometimes with Nathaniel, and every single time she thought about how close she had come to staying silent that night at dinner. She could have kept the secret buried, avoided the confrontation, avoided the fear of upsetting a powerful family. But something inside her, some quiet, unshakable sense of right and wrong that her father had instilled in her since childhood, refused to let the truth stay hidden any longer. And because of that single moment of courage, an entire family, broken for 30 years by fear and silence, finally found its way back to itself. Margaret Cross was no longer known as the woman everyone feared. Slowly, quietly, she became known instead as a woman who had survived something unimaginable, who had spent 30 years punishing herself for a choice made out of desperation rather than cruelty, and who, when finally given the chance, chose love over fear at last. And every year, on the same date that Sophie first sat across from Nathaniel in that cracked red booth, the family gathered together, not in the cold, silent dining room of the mansion, but in the small, warm diner where it all began, celebrating not just a love story, but a family finally fully found.